need to, in part, make some amends for our past mistakes or misdeeds in that regard. So, you know, if you try to judge everything in this world politically, or even in people's personal lives, we'll leave that aside, by you know, something they've done in the past, so how dare they now, you know, say something else? It seems to me that we would have a world in which the capacity for moral reevaluation, ethical reevaluation, including evaluation of one's own actions in the past, a world where that is a very rare activity. And I think it should be a rather more common activity. So that's how I would respond to the cheekiness part. On the other, about the argument of protecting the innocent, or the particular horrific nature of the regime, and I think everyone agreed that it was. It strikes me that in that regard, we really run up against a serious problem, and I don't know how you all think about this, and I would welcome any instruction. I remember having a conversation with the head of one of the big international human rights organizations, who, in response to a series of questions, this was at a conference in Berlin some years ago, a direct question was if this particular regime had in fact committed genocide. And this was a matter of historic record, there was no doubt about it. And nothing was done at the time, but this, you know, for a variety of reasons, the same people were still in power who had done this. We now have the capacity to do something about it. You know, we are not at all certain that that regime will refrain from such activities in the future. Can we, on the basis of what happened in the past, this systematic and egregious violence, if not continuing in that way, can we take action? And his answer was no, you can't. It has to be something that's happening right this minute. And then and this was provocative, of course, the interlocutor went on to say, well, suppose that, you know, made a hypothetical, you know, the Hitler regime had committed this genocide against the Jews and other peoples, but they were still in power. The thing had happened, it was in the past. We now had the force to take this regime out. Would we have been morally justified in doing so? And the answer was no, because they're not doing it now. Now, there's something suspicious to me about that argument. I mean, it strikes me that so long as you have the same people in charge and the same sort of will to act in that way, given a particular set of circumstances that regime may face, that can't be a kind of absolute trump card. I mean, I think it has to be taken into account. They're not doing it now. And you would need to investigate why they're not doing it now. You know, maybe they're so contained now that they wouldn't think about doing it again. Not that they've had a change of will, but, you know, there's so much pressure, and they're hemmed in and they won't do it again. But I don't have an easy answer for that. I think that's a difficult one. And it does raise the question, it goes back to ancient just war thinking about punishment. You know, that regimes who have committed certain horrific and egregious misdeeds could justly be punished. And the question that we're putting, that you've put quite rightly, is can they be punished sometime after the fact? Or has it got to be, you know, what they're doing at this very minute? And if you miss that moment, you can't do anything about it in the future. And I don't know the answer to that. I mean, all I've done is to elaborate the problem, I'm afraid. Something tells me that the argument you can't ever do anything is not quite right. But I don't know a good way to explore why that isn't quite right. I've made some hints, but that strikes me as a difficult one. The cheekiness one, I think, is more readily dealt with. Yeah, Jeff.
Can I just follow up on that? It seems to me that you have to distinguish here between defense as a just cause for war and punishment or retribution as a just cause for war. I think you're quite right at the end of your remarks to shift the discussion towards the question of whether punishment of wrongdoers can be a just cause for war,
Yeah.
because in some of these cases, that is precisely what's at issue when we think that a regime that remains in power is guilty of atrocious behavior in the past, but poses no threat presently or foreseeably in the future. And I guess I would say the central problem with thinking about retribution and punishment as a just cause for war is that war isn't finally discriminating enough as an instrument of punishment. You don't punish merely the wrongdoers. You end up directing force against a large number of people who were not themselves involved in the actions in the past. So there's a lot of turnover in armed forces, and it may well be that the people who bear the brunt of military force now join the military long after the acts for which the regime is supposed to be being punished, and that's just not just.
No, I thank you. That's helpful, and it reminds me of something else I should have said and didn't, which is, and specifically with Iraq in mind, which is that punishment ex post facto, punishment after the fact, it strikes me, can't stand alone as a casus belli. It seems to me that that could be a cluster, part of a cluster of other reasons, hopefully that have some salience and some strength. But certainly the nature of the regime itself is something that one can reasonably take account of. And if the nature of that regime is such that these are things that it has undertaken in the past, and we have no reason to believe they might not do it again if they get a chance, that should certainly figure, I think, or can reasonably figure in our calculations. But it strikes me that out of the blue to say, back, 10 years ago they did this, thus and so, we're going to go, and go in for regime change now, no. But if there are other exigent reasons and purposes, and the nature of the regime will come into play, I think reasonably at that point, or could. So thank you for your question, because it reminds me I was thinking that and didn't say it, put it in that context. Certainly if the horrors are being perpetrated at that moment, then that could be a standalone reason. But I think otherwise, as horrible and tragic as it is, there are lots of things that on some moral scale could be morally justified, but that within the world of international relations, the world of the ethical use of force and so on, I think you have to be more prudent and more wary.
You began by talking about the Iraq War, so I'd just like to say something about that. And I don't think it's a pure case of preventive war. Let's say we think there's a very high barrier against preventive wars in which you eliminate another state's weaponry because you think they might use it aggressively in the future.
Yeah, I don't think let me just add, I don't want to preempt your question. It's not prevention or preemption in the case of your question, but I just wanted to say that I wasn't setting Iraq up as a case of preventive use of force. I was just indicating that it was a war that occasioned those kinds of discussions. So go ahead.
Well,
go ahead.
Then maybe you won't disagree with me.
Yeah.
But even though that's true, once a state has committed aggression, forcibly disarming it to incapacitate it for future aggressions is a perfectly legitimate war. So the Allies were permitted to forcibly disarm Germany and Japan in 1945. Right. And the UN coalition was permitted to demand elimination of Iraq's weapons of mass destruction in 1991. That was built into the ceasefire agreement. So there was this, that was reaffirmed in Security Council resolutions. So the use of force against Iraq has been suspended if, but only if, Iraq eliminated weapons of mass destruction. They hadn't publicly and clearly done that. And so you can see the use of force insofar as it was directed at weapons of mass destruction in 2003 III as being a kind of continuation
Right,
of the
right.
1991 war, rather than a pure case of prevention,
Right, right.
as the use of force against North Korea
Yeah.
or Iran would
Yeah.
have been.
I
That
just-
isn't to say it was justified because there were inspectors on the